CTC to give a more policy or public-facing interpretation of the research that they're doing. We've had one speaker or so every month for the last 5 or 6 years, so we're just delighted to finally have Dr. Marina Zaloznaya from the University of Iowa joining us to share some of her most recent research on corruption. Dr. Zaloznaya is on the sociology faculty since 2012 and received her PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. She's the author of The Politics of Bureaucratic Corruption in Post-Transitional Eastern Europe, which I can highly recommend. It's a fantastic book on the subject, and I cite it in a lot of my own work. She's also edited special issues of the journal Democracia, and she's going to be speaking, I think, on some of her most recent works today with her collaborators, which I'm sure you'll talk about, Reisinger, Maple, and saying, drawing on some representative surveys in Russia, China, Ukraine, and Georgia. So we're going to have Dr. Zaloznaya talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and deliver some opening remarks, and then have the rest of the hour for question and answer. So please save your questions to the end, but we should be able to get to all of them, assuming not every single one of you has a question. But thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours. I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much, David. It's such an honor to be here. I've been waiting for an invitation for a while, but I'm glad that I'm still considered up and coming. Thank you for having me. Today I'm going to talk to you about civic connotations of public sector corruption and implications of these connotations for the usual way that we fight corruption of this kind. And may I?
Absolutely. I still would.
So, it's a little bit off, but I'm going to keep talking. Here in the slides you can see a quote by President Biden in which he basically connects corruption to the decline of democracy around the world. And this quote is taken from the White House strategy on fighting corruption. And President Biden is not wrong. Cross-national studies connect corruption of different kinds to a variety of social issues, right? So from economic issues like poverty levels and inequality and rates of growth to political problems and social problems. And for the sake of this presentation, I would like to highlight the links between high levels of corruption and lack of civil liberties and political rights. But remember, this is done on cross-national level, so basically this research finds that countries that tend to score higher on the corruption indicators, which is one number assigned to a country annually by an NGO, Transparency International, tend to also score highly on, or low, I suppose, on indicators of civil liberties and political rights. Now, this research has inspired an entire legal and policy regime that I call global anti-corruption or anti-corruptionism. Some folks call it a regime, others call it an industry, a transnational legal order. But basically, it's a body of international law, as well as epistemic communities of scholars and policy analysts and journalists who investigate corruption issues all over the world and then create policy recommendations for how to fight corruption. Also, this regime comes with a variety of funding mechanisms for fighting corruption in very specific ways. So over time, there is sort of crystallized and specific policy prescriptions that have developed that typically get extended to from the international community to countries that are looking to deal with their corruption problem with both carrot and stick strategies, from conditional loans to economic sanctions and diplomatic pressures. Even though one of the sort of foundational motivations for anti-corruptionism, global anti-corruptionism, is so this desire to fight corruption as a way to promote democracy. Over the last 2 decades, we have seen a global decline in democracy worldwide. These are the Freedom House measures for democracy. In 2022, we had a 17th consecutive year where the number of countries whose democracy quality has improved has been lower than the number of countries whose democracy has backslid or democratic indicators have weakened. Now, of course, the growth of anti-corruptionism and democratic backsliding are two co-occurrent phenomena. It doesn't mean that there is a causal relationship, and ultimately it's an empirical question. But I guess my point here is to say that there's something that's going on here. There's something about the way that we are fighting corruption around the world that is not working for democratic promotion. And today I'm going to highlight some of the ways in which anti-corruption reforms may undermine the strength of democracy, specifically in non-democratic societies. So what is democracy, non-democratic societies? Well, non-democratic societies are generally societies that, that don't have free and fair elections. However, they range in terms of the degree of civil liberties and political rights that their citizens get. I will focus specifically on one kind of corruption. This is very important because corruption is this umbrella term, and people talk about all sorts of things when they use this term. But I'm going to be talking to you about everyday small-scale exchanges between service providers, basically those street-level bureaucrats in healthcare, education, law enforcement, and their clients, whereby in exchange for bribes, favors, promises of favors, bureaucrats provide either the services that they are required to provide by law or better, more convenient, more timely services. Now, this kind of corruption is exceedingly common around the world. In fact, I don't know this for sure, but I like to say that it's probably one of the most common crimes around the world, as according to Transparency International, a quarter of people around the world report having bribed a public official in preceding 12 months. And within the anti-corruptionism regime, we have developed very concrete set of prescriptions of how to deal with this problem. And the three main pillars of good governance reforms are increased competition, so decentralizing public services and privatizing them to encourage competition, eradicate corruption that way, decreasing discretion of bureaucrats by replacing them with electronic services, or increasing accountability mechanisms, like for instance the stuff that David has written about the asset declaration, so bureaucrats are required to reveal their income, as well as increased accountability through effective policing and judiciary. Now, these reforms are exceedingly popular. They're very popular for a few reasons. First of all, when the international community is trying to fight corruption somewhere, it's a daunting task, right? Where do you even start in places that are like Russia or China, riddled with corruption? Well, this kind of reforms are actually feasible and tend to be politically non-threatening, meaning that even non-democratic leaders tend to be open to adopting this kind of reforms in their countries. They also align with the whole range of different neoliberal reforms that the international community has promoted in developing countries for a long time now. So they decreasing, shrinking the state essentially is a very foundational part of restructuring policies. So this doesn't sound like anything weird or crazy to folks in Washington or in Brussels. Now, I, however, am going to argue to you that in politically unfree societies, specifically, good governance reforms are actually likely to undermine civic awareness and collective political participation, and therefore be detrimental to the health of democracy. In non-democratic societies, such corruption is associated with increased connectivity or linkages across social cleavages, so it's associated with ties between people that bring them outside of their insular circles, and therefore actually look like, structurally resemble civil society in free societies, right? In more politically open countries, and therefore favorable to civic awareness and collective political action. I'm going to try to prove this empirically. So obviously corruption is typically thought of as antithetical to civic health. right? So this kind of thinking is started with the work of Edward Banfield in the 60s, who wrote about an Italian town under the pseudonym of Montegrano, where he noted high levels of political apathy, so citizens were not engaged politically, and he explained that with the fact that people tend to sort of focus on their own insular networks, and therefore were less likely to collaborate with others in pursuit of collective good, including political good. So, you know, we think of corruption as each man for himself, as, you know, personal benefit at the expense of public good. And cross-national studies once again support this view because they show that in high corruption countries, democratic attitudes and voluntary association levels and generalized trust are lower than in countries with low levels of corruption. However, I think that there is reason to doubt this conventional wisdom. First of all, we've noticed that in both Russia and China, two places where anti-corruptionism has been implemented, specifically good governance reforms implemented, was associated with decreased collective action by citizens. Also, if you look at this list of countries, these are some countries with the highest levels of public sector corruption around the world, right? So this is the percent of citizens that report annually giving bribes, right? We're talking about 77% in Yemen, 50% in Egypt, and, you know, more relevant for us in Ukraine, for instance, 38%. Yet these are also countries that have seen some of the most amazing grassroots protests over the last 2 decades. You know, I'm thinking about Orange Revolution and Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, or Arab Spring. So something doesn't quite compute. I am actually going to argue to you today that public sector corruption sustains not negative, but positive social capital by nurturing the networks that bring people outside of their insular groups, that connect them with people across social cleavages, birds of different feather, right? People with different political beliefs, people of different gender, people of different ethnic groups, so people who are not like them. And because it creates these channels, information and resources can flow through these channels outside of the purview of the state. And in the case that we're going to look at today, Russia, this is the only way. These are the only kind of channels of this nature. So we know that in, you know, democratic countries, you have voluntary organizations, church organizations, NGOs, clubs. These are all third places. These are all places where people of different kinds can connect and collaborate outside of the control of the state. In authoritarian regimes, civil society organizations like this do not exist. And the ones that exist are completely controlled or at least surveilled by the state. So I'm arguing that in such instances, public sector corruption networks can take place of this formal civil society organizations. So first, empirically, I'm going to show you that corruption can sustain positive social capital. Of course, corruption is based on networks. Case studies from the region of interest to us here show that people use connections and acquaintances to pass bribes, to receive advice, get protection, vouch on somebody's behalf. So ultimately, exchanges between a bureaucrat and a citizen from the street are very rare. Instead, people ferret out connections that can connect them safely to a bureaucrat. And what kind of connections are especially useful for to carry out public sector corruption transactions? First of all, these are connections that can help you with placement, or connections that themselves are connected to others, right? So these are not the insular connections, because in the groups within which you, with whom you interact, often people who are just like you also will have the same kind of connections as you do, right? So these are going to be redundant connections. Here, however, I'm saying that in order to give a bribe, you're most likely to succeed if you know somebody who has different kind of connections than you do. So these end up being outward-oriented networks. And second, these kind of networks should agree to help you out, right? So you can't just have a weak tie in conventional understanding in sociology and political science. Rather, you have to have somebody who's mobilizable. It's somebody who will be willing to risk their own reputation and potentially put themselves in an uncomfortable or dangerous position to help you out. So basically, my hypothesis is that citizens who participate in public sector corruption are going to report greater number of contacts who are not related to them. Here I'm thinking about non-kin specifically because those who are related to you tend to, this is the social capital that's insular, as well as those who are simultaneously well-connected and mobilizable. Now, I'm going to focus, my data is from Russia. In 2018, along with a couple of collaborators, Bill Reisinger and Vicky Claypool, we collected a public opinion survey. So we hired a data collection firm in Russia that assembled a sample of 2,300 adults, and through face-to-face household-based interviews, we administered a questionnaire that contained 138 questions, and they were specifically about the corruption behavior. This is probably the last time. I mean, the timing is perfect because after that, I don't know if it's going to be possible to replicate ever again. But, we asked people about their experiences with corruption. We asked them about their political attitudes and behaviors, and we asked them about the egocentric networks. Egocentric networks are personal networks, right? So people that you're close to for a variety of reasons. We measured corruption behavior by asking whether or not they've made additional payments to service providers. Our results correspond to the average estimate of how many Russians do it, 30%. Now, how did we measure networks? Well, we had this, what is called a dump question, where you ask your respondents to think of up to 5 people with whom they would share news among their family, immediate family, extended family, and friends, colleagues, and neighbors. So the maximum number of contacts people could report is 15, and it's a lot of networks. For GSS, General Social Services in the U.S. has 3 alters that people report. Oops, sorry. And then we asked questions about these people that folks reported, right? So we asked, do you perceive this contact to be rich in useful connections? This was our measure of external orientation of an alter. And then we asked, are you especially likely to ask this contact if you needed a big favor? If both said yes, then we counted this alter as a strategic alter for corruption purposes. So these are our results in magenta, I should say magenta. You see, these are folks who reported giving a bribe, and this who said no. So you see that consistently, bribe givers are more likely to have reported non-kin connections, right? So they're more likely to be connected with people outside of their immediate group. Also, they're more likely to have to be connected to people rich in connections themselves, and mobilizable alters. So in combination of the two, we find that people who report giving bribes are also more likely to have the networks that I'm thinking, and I'm going to show you later, are connected with more civic behavior and attitudes. So the second part is, do people who give bribes actually participate politically at higher levels than those who do not? We know that positive social capital, the kind of social capital that I described bribe givers as having, tends to inspire reciprocity, raise civic awareness, as well as reduce transaction cost of civic behavior, right? When you have this kind of connections, you're likely to get information from them that you haven't heard before. You're likely to know how to organize and how to connect with these people who are different from you in pursuit of a common goal. So this is my hypothesis number 2. I anticipated that citizens who engage in corruption are more likely to report political participation, both institutionalized and non-institutionalized, than those who did not give bribes. Measured institutionalized political participation as signing a petition, attending a demonstration, joining a strike, sharing political views on social media. Again, this is 2018, so before the crackdown in sharing political news for citizens, as well as voting or institutionalized political participation. And here you see the results for this regressions. We see that people who report voluntary or extorted bribery are significantly more likely to vote and significantly more likely to participate politically. Now, to recap, I showed you that bribe givers are more likely to have networks that look like civil society networks. And then, on the other hand, I showed you that they are more likely to participate politically. But how do we know that it's not just because they're more active people, right? Or there's something else about them that differentiates them from bribe givers? How do we know that the political charge actually goes through this network? One way to get at it in our data was to ask them with who they discuss politics. We know from political science literature that discussing politics with so that people form their political attitudes and decide whether or not to participate politically based on who they discuss politics with. So I thought that this can really show that the vector of the political charge goes through the networks. So for each of our alters, we asked them different questions, right? We asked them, so they got a list, our respondents got a list of all of the people that they named, and then we went through them one by one, asking, show us on this list who you discuss politics with. Show us on this list who is more connected than you. Show us on this list that who you would ask for corruption advice. So for our purposes here, what I want to show you that those alters who were identified as corruption partners, who you would ask for corruption advice, are also the same people who influence the respondents politically. So together, I think that this shows that citizens who engage in corruption tend to have more positive social capital than those who do not engage in corruption. Political information travels through corruption networks, and then people who engage in corruption are more active politically. So these informal transactions essentially weave a layer of infrastructure, of exchange in the lives of these people, right? In the absence of the formal alternatives for this kind of connections, it can offer a platform for political collaboration and mobilization. Now, does this mean that public sector corruption is good for civic health of autocracies? I don't want to say that, right? Because obviously in the long term it's associated with all sorts of negative things. However, if you look at or imagine Russia with public sector corruption networks and without, the one with public sector corruption networks is going to have more civically oriented people than the one without. So, given the constraints that non-free political societies present to their citizenry, it is a better outcome. Public sector corruption actually can maintain this third space that exists in democracies. So what does this mean in terms of policy recommendation? Well, you know, I'm not a policy person, so these are very broad. I was thinking that while currently public sector corruption is used to you know, people usually think of as sort of the first matter of business. We're going to start with these good governance reforms, and then essentially the institutions are going to change, and there's going to be change on the you know, among the political and economic elites. I think that the order should be reversed. I think that public sector corruption reforms, good governance reforms, should come as the last step. in cleaning up corruption. They should only be pursued once there are political freedoms, specifically freedoms of expression and association. In the meantime, what do? Well, this is sort of me imagining things, but I was thinking maybe decriminalization of corruption markets could be a good idea, because decriminalizing them would take away the opportunity for autocrats to tighten their grip on bureaucracies through anti-corruption. And that would sort of preserve the space for free exchange of information and goods and resources without actually symbolically approving corruption as a thing, right? So it would be a temporary decriminalization. So this is it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful, provocative talk. As is our custom here, I usually kick off with one question, and we'll give her a chance to respond, and then we'll start collecting them from the audience. So yeah, there's a lot of counterintuitive insights from this talk, and like I said, very thought-provoking. It reminded me of some work that I've seen on China that looks at personality. And for example, they've done a lot of surveys of Chinese citizens and found that introverted people are much more likely to oppose the communist regime in China, and extroverted people are much more pro-regime, more pro-communist party. So, and then in some sense, the people that are very social and very ambitious and very career-oriented join the party, because that's where the opportunities are, and the people that are cynical and that are angry or disappointed or frustrated with their current things usually reject the party because maybe it's not getting their opportunities, or maybe that's just their nature. And it made me think whether or not you're also finding some overlap with your corruption versus not. And that people who are very ambitious, they're office-seeking, they want to get ahead, they want to make money, they're in the business world, maybe their ethical compass is weaker, and they see corruption as a tool to getting ahead, and they're just more integrated into the fabric of society, and that's the type of person that's the mover and shaker in modern-day corrupt Russia. Whereas the people that are much angry at the way the system works, much less prone to use a bribe if given the opportunity in the situation, are more removed, more atomized, more isolated are the ones that are not paying corruption. So I want to have you speculate a little bit. Is it corruption, is it unlocking opportunities, or is it a reflection of the person who's given the opportunity to engage it or not? And then if that's setting, then maybe Russia's just a place where the corrupt get ahead and they get all the opportunities and they vote and they join organizations, and the non-corrupt sit at home angrily on the computer and look for opportunities to leave and other types of resistance. So how does that relationship strike you?
You absolutely put your finger on it. I think that what is a very likely alternative explanation, right? So there is something about this 30%, right? There's this, I'm saying 30% because that's the number or proportion of Russians that report giving bribes. There's something about them, and perhaps that's just they are more oriented toward being engaged, right? Being engaged formally and informally. It could be. As a sociologist, I bristle at personality-based explanations, right? Because they don't take us anywhere, right? So, okay, so if somebody's extroverted, somebody's introverted, you're not going to change. What kind of policy implication would, that kind of research have? That said, I think that actually doesn't really matter. For the sake of this kind of argument, it doesn't matter what makes them different from others. What matters is that the networks that they create are stable networks that are not surveilled by the state. You know what I mean? So, yes, there is something that drives them, perhaps a personality characteristic or whatever it might be, to build these networks. But once they build them, they're there, these people are connected, and through these networks, both the information and resources can float in a way that they cannot float in modern, present day Russia. And ultimately this does not really undermine the argument that we should not go after these networks first thing in the corruption.
I agree. Yeah, the networks are definitely. I don't deny that there's a consequence of corruption creating these networks. That seems really. I'm just curious how they got to be there. Yeah, if you're two people, they both have the opportunity to bribe. Some people respond positively and some people respond negatively to that situation, and some of that's just built on what we think is right and wrong.
And I think one thing that you really got correct in your comment was that corruption is very much about opportunity now. So for a long time, social scientists working on the region have thought about corruption as a coping mechanism, right? This was sort of based on blood networks during the Soviet Union. Given the deficit of consumer goods, people had to rely on each other to procure things. After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, money became in deficit, right? So people still continue to rely on each other. It looks, even though the networks have been preserved over time, their function is quite different now. Most people report, so overwhelming majority of our respondents said that they got better service than they would have otherwise through these networks, and that they did it because they wanted to get a better service, right? So it's not that the service is not available to them without corruption. It is available. It's just bad. So corruption is a way of getting ahead. And I think this is a big change in terms of how we think about ordinary people. How we think about ordinary people, social mobility, and it has not yet been incorporated formally in the research, right? Because my question now is, what does this mean for inequality, right? One thing that we notice is that rich people are more likely to engage in corruption, for sure, but the importance of wealth in determining people's likelihood of engaging in corruption is actually smaller than the importance of having these networks. So in some ways, it's possible that these networks help diminish inequality, at least around the fringes.
Fascinating. Let's take a couple questions from the audience. If you do a favor, just be concise and ask a question, and please introduce yourself, just who you are and your affiliation. So, yes, please.
Evgeny Roshin, Kissinger Center Studies, Johns Hopkins. I have a question on data, on interpretation, and policy implications, if I may. First of all, regarding data, you started with the claim that NGOs and voluntary organizations do not exist in countries such as Russia, and that's why you formulate this hypothesis. So I wonder where you take this data from, because as someone who lived in St. Petersburg until 2022, I still have many friends who work in NGOs, in voluntary organizations, uncontrolled by FSB. Then further on, do you differentiate data between urban and rural population? Again, as a city dweller, I noticed that over the years, institutions started to pick up momentum and started to be more effective. So in the recent years, it was more and more difficult to give or take a bribe as far as basic services are concerned. Moreover, in the cities, the wealth was growing, and if you were not satisfied with the service, you can simply go for a commercial option, right? And then here I arrive at the interpretation question. Let's put it this way. I know people who use those services with someone who you described in your research, to get a better placement at school or university, in places like that. And they described their counterparts, to me in various terms. And I would think that those are the last people they would listen to when it comes to politics. Simply because they held them really despicable. When it came to politics, you would discuss it with friends and family. given that the repressions were increasing, not with those who would be responsible for placing it. So the question about interpretation is this: what kind of meaning do you attach to political influence? What do you mean when you say that those people who help you with placement influence you politically? And last but not least, implications. So you say that 30% of your respondents reported that they gave or took bribes. So which means 70% did not engage in that activity.
Not report.
Or did not report. So if 70% of the population does not engage in that activity, why then bother protecting this, from policy reforms?
All right, let me try to take them one by one. So you're saying that NGOs that are uncontrolled by FSB exist in Russia. Yes, I'm sure. This is not my area of expertise. I'm sure they do exist still. However, they are a dying beast right now, and there's not that many. So they're not accessible to an average Russian outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow. So, yeah, I'm not interested in making absolute claims. I'm just saying that civil society is this big, and in the United States or Western Europe, it's tiny. Literally, governmentally free space to interact is small and inaccessible to ordinary citizens. In contemporary Russian, the way it's going, it's getting worse. So these kind of networks, on the other hand, are pervasive, even if we only have 30% of people responding. I'm going to go to your last question. They are pervasive, right? So first of all, obviously it's a conservative estimate because people are not likely to tell you. The number is likely higher in reality. Second of all, 30% is not little of, what's Russia's population?
142.
And you can calculate 30% of that, right?
Kids excluded.
No, so my point is that
800 million.
yeah, I don't think that this is a small number of people, neglectable number of people or portion of the population. Your question about why bother is more of a normative question. I guess my answer is that if we want to preserve civic charge in a society where the government is doing everything to eliminate free thinking, if that is our goal, then this is potentially an overlooked area of freedom. About your second question, rural versus urban distribution. Yeah, that's absolutely right. The dynamics of public sector corruption is very different in the cities as they are than they are in the countryside. It's interesting that in both places, or in both kind of settings, most respondents report participating in corruption to get a better kind of public services, right? So, while in the Soviet Union there was two options. You either get public service in the state-run organization, or you get it through theater tickets, or you get it through blood, right? Now there's multiple options, right? You can go to a state-run university, you can go to a private university, you can, at least till 2022, you could live and go to university abroad, right? So there's just this, the market is divided in a variety of different tiers, but the public sector service market specifically is divided itself, right? You can go through clean way and you can go through corrupt way. And the corrupt way seems to just be more successful. And perhaps it's cheaper than going and getting a service commercially. I don't know, or perhaps the kind of specialist that you want. You know, we know that a lot of them, for instance, good doctors work for the state hospitals, and you know, you go into a small private practice is not as prestigious, not considered by Russians as prestigious for your medical services. So there's a variety of reasons to stick with public sector services, and perhaps in the cities more so than. In the countryside more so than in the cities, because your options are more limited. And within that choice, then there's different tracks, going without payments or going through payments. And lastly, discussing politics, that's the hardest question, I think, out of all four. What kind of charge? So what do I mean by political influence going through networks? So the measure that we used was literally about discussing politics, right? So the question that we asked, please identify list of authors, please identify the people with whom you discuss politics. And then the next question was, please identify people who you would turn to for help with a corrupt behavior, given a bribe.
Did you detail the term discuss?
No.
Okay.
No, this is 138 questions, was already a bit too much. And then we saw the overlap in these networks, right? So it's the same people who people ask for, talk about politics with, and go for corrupt change. But what I wanted to say really is a bigger thing, is that you don't necessarily have to discuss politics directly. You don't have to go and say, what do you think about, you know, Putin changing the constitution to be able to run for the consecutive term in office. Rather, it's the fact that you're connecting with people with whom you would have never connected on an everyday basis, other than through this bribe-giving activity, and you learn to collaborate with them. And you learn to find a common good. And that is a foundation of a civil society in traditional Putnam-esque sense, right? So it doesn't have to be overtly political. It's the ability to work with somebody for the common good outside of the purview of the state that literally creates this civic-minded citizens. Yeah, you're not convinced.
We'll discuss later.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Eva Isakovich. I am curious, sort of in a similar vein, like the inference that there is certainly a smaller population of CSOs, et cetera, in Russia relative to other places, and that can be replaced or supplemented in some meaningful way with these corruption networks. I'm curious what other questions or elements in the data pointed to those corruption networks and like being civic-minded, to being politically inclined and desiring political reform and potentially being more liberal-minded, as opposed to an individual seeing utility in corruption.
Thank you for this question. It's important to note that people who reported giving bribes were not necessarily people who were opposition-oriented, right? So they were just as likely to support Putin as in United Russia elections as others. So in this sense, we can think about these networks as unactivated structural foundation for civil society, right? So again, in sort of classical tradition, political science and sociology, civil society consists of several different things. It consists of structure itself, of a platform where people can connect with others who are different from them. The second layer are attitudes, and usually these are pro-democratic attitudes. And third one is political behavior. Right now, there is the political behavior part that I've showed, and there is the structural part that I showed. But the attitudinal part that you're talking about is missing. So even though people were more likely to participate politically, it doesn't mean that they were more likely to push back against the state. A lot of this participation could be pro-state, right? But ultimately, for the sake of the argument, again, it doesn't matter, because what we want is not people who sit at home and say, oh, I can't do anything about this. But rather people, whatever it is, whatever that is, you know, whether what they agree with is different from what we think, right? But rather people who have a platform to connect to others and translate that connection into political action later on, whatever that political action is. Okay? So Russians have been traditionally accused in the literature of being civically apathetic. Right? It's a plot. Yet in these informal networks, they're quite active, right? So maybe one of the implications of my findings is that could these networks be thought of as creating political change, right? Could this be a prototypical civil society? But the attitudinal element is in a kind of Western conception of civil society is missing from this picture in Russia right now.
Great. I thought I saw another hand before. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Zara Ganadian, and I'm from FHI 360. I was wondering first if you notice any interesting demographic trends in your data, like maybe there's some group that's more likely to give bribes or things like that. And then second, I feel like you touched on this a bit in one of your other answers, but I'm still interested to hear, is that did you look at if the people in your study, you talked about how you also try to determine if they're, if they participated civically a lot. Did you look at if they participated in like the small remaining actual civil society? Because they're very active, so were they active in that too, or did they, no?
Yeah. So starting with the second question, no. The number of people who reported actually being a part of some sort of interest group was minuscule in this, not enough to even include in analysis, unfortunately. So the combination of absent tradition of civic engagement from the Soviet times and kind of the absence of easily accessible NGOs and CSOs that are not GNGO, refer to the concept of governmental, non-governmental organizations. These are the NGOs that exist in Russia now. People are not really seeking out these opportunities. In terms of the demographic differences in people's corruption behavior, there's a few interesting findings. So we know that richer people are more likely to participate, well-connected people are more likely to participate. One thing that I find interesting is that men and women appear to participate on kind of the superficial level. If you look at literally proportion of men who report giving bribes and proportion of women who report giving bribes is equal. Which it's a different paper, but it struck me that finding, because usually we know that if we think about corruption as an economic opportunity, we know that women generally lose out on economic opportunities in the formal market. So I investigated this further and with a colleague, and what we found was that even though men and women participate at the same rates, they participate in different places. So women are more likely to give bribes in places that are where bribery is not as consequential, like welfare organizations, right? Hospitals, social services, passport tables, whatever, schools. While men tend to be more likely to give bribes in places where it actually matters, right? So police, courts, places like that, inspectors, various licensing officers, so places that really have a monopoly on service, right? So you can choose to go to a private school or public school, but you cannot choose which cop you want to deal with, right? And besides that, besides being sort of concentrated in different institutional sectors, women tend to give more and get less back than men. It's really interesting to find, because we asked what you got back. So sexism is alive and well in informal markets, just as it is in formal markets.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name's Charles Smeltzer. I'm a student here at George Washington University. I'd like to touch on your vision of decriminalization, and specifically question the requirement that these networks are operating outside of the purview of the state. If this is not a requirement, would it be possible to institutionalize bribe? That's my question.
Yeah, ultimately transitioning to private markets is that institutionalizing bribery in a lot of ways. You know, so you pay just in the open. But once you do that, then you lose. Once you legalize it completely, if you legalize it completely, you lose the clandestine nature of it. So you lose the secrecy that it currently has, and therefore you no longer can hide from the state, right? So the reason why decriminalization is something that's appealing to me, and I have not thought this through at all, so my question is probably very stupid. My answer is very stupid. But I'm thinking that I would like something that does not symbolically say we're okay with this, but still keeps it on the down low, so that the autocrat and the state cannot see what's going on, right? So one thing that I think happens in these networks is that they are one of the few places where citizens in contemporary Russia can do things that are not seen or controlled by the state, outside of their private homes, and in collaboration with each other. So decriminalization seems to me like it's some sort of compromise, but it has to be temporary, right? Until people can associate freely. Again, think about Russia currently with public sector corruption or without public sector corruption. We have Russia without public sector corruption. It's called Belarus. It's not better civically than Russia. So Belarus, for instance, in certain sectors, Lukashenko has cracked down on corruption. Higher education is completely free of corruption. Now, it's not a democratically rooted transparency. It's based on fear. Because at some point, Lukashenko became aware that students were likely to mobilize against him. And there was waves of protest where Belarusian students came out and pushed back against the state. So his government instituted sort of stricter accountability mechanisms, more surveillance in universities, and also got rid of corruption. But universities without corruption in Belarus are less conducive to people. Literally, Lukashenko attacked it because the corruption space was also overlapping with the political space in the universities.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so you said earlier that some of these bribe-giving Russians, they use their political networks that they form to support Putin and unite Russia. So my question is, do you think that they actually might be incentivized to support the non-democratic regime because they think that if a democracy came into power, they would crack down on corruption and stop their ability to get ahead in society, as you said?
Yeah, thank you. It's a common theory that political scientists put out there about corruption. So basically the idea of this trade-off, right? So if the autocrat and the government moves away from the corruption markets, then in exchange, citizens support them. But data does not bear this out. So we see that people who engage in corruption are less satisfied with economic performance of the political elites and just the job performance. They evaluate their job performance as poor. So I think that the data from Russia and from China suggests that no, it's not that it's this social contract between citizens and their autocrat. Rather, people would rather have a system where they don't have to give bribes, basically. It's sort of this double thing, right? They would rather not, but given the situation in which they want to give bribes, right? Given
But do they think that like a democracy would bring better services to one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, on both local and federal level in Russia, people who give bribes are less satisfied with bureaucratic performance and sort of their officials in general.
I think we probably have time for one more question.
Alexander Fesin, visiting scholars here. My question is about the future of this system, and my question is about what drive political protest in autocratic societies. Is it an attempt to change corruption equilibria and to fight corruptions from above, for example? From the what is the driver of political action in your system?
Well, this is thank you. This is a little bit outside of the purview of this research. We know that there have been multiple anti-governmental protests around the world that have started as anti-corruption protests. So we know that one of the few viable oppositional candidates in Russia, Navalny, organized around, his followers organized around the issue of corruption. So I think that corruption as a problem speaks to people, right? So it has a very strong mobilizing potential. So even in authoritarian regimes, people might get together. But it's generally, when people think about corruption in this sense, they think about high-level corruption, right? So it's, it's what Putin and Medvedev, what kind of wealth they've accumulated, and sort of the connections between them and the oligarchs. This kind of stuff makes people really angry, rather than small-scale corruption. But we've seen potential for large-scale corruption to bring people together. We've seen it in Ukraine as well, because both Euromaidan and Revolution of Dignity, well, Revolution of Dignity was more about Yanukovych not wanting to go the European route, but Orange Revolution for sure was certainly in large part due to people's dissatisfaction with the corruption of their leaders.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and give another round of applause.